just do this, and I'll sit on this one. And then Jen, I'll start with, that's okay. So welcome to, this is the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project Public Forum. We have a slightly bigger room than usual because we have a wonderful group of panelists here. And I'm Kenji Kushida, Research Associate and Project Leader of the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project. First, a couple words about this project. It's a co-production of the Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford University and the US Asia Technology Management Center. And there are several things that we do, but since we're on this slide, first we'd like to thank our sponsors that make all of this possible. We have several levels of sponsors, diamond sponsor, Kozo Keikaku Engineering, platinum sponsor, Komatsu, gold sponsors, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the NEDO, New Energy and Industrial Technology Development Organization, WIL, World Innovation Lab, and our silver sponsors, ANA, MUFG, Nomura Research Institute, and Rakuten. So thank you. So a bit about our project. Ever since a few years ago, it became clear that there's a resurgence of interest in Japan of Silicon Valley. And then in Silicon Valley, there's a new interest in, a renewed interest in Japan again. Historically, Japan was a competitor. The large firms came in when Silicon Valley was full of manufacturing and outcompeted a lot of the players here. And Silicon Valley shifted, moved towards open innovation. Startups became more part of the ecosystem, became very successful. Large firms grew out of this. And a lot of large firms buy the small firms, which is why we have an ecosystem that works supported by both. And Japan then moved in to try to figure out how to make use of or how to harness Silicon Valley. So the key word really is harness, make use of, or in Japanese, katsuyo. So there have been many plans around the world to try to duplicate a Silicon Valley ecosystem, and the world is littered with failed projects of something, something, insert place name, Silicon Valley, and it didn't work out. And for many years, Japan, among other places, have tried this. And it's good to try more vibrant ecosystem, try to see what you can do. But at the same time, let's all harness what already works here. But then how do you do it if you're a startup or if you're a large firm? And that brings us to today's panel, because we're very excited to have a lineup of people who have experiences broad and wide dealing with how to harness Silicon Valley, especially if you're coming from the outside and have words of wisdom for that. The last thing I'm going to say about our project is we do this kind of public forum series with networking. So if you did not get a chance to exchange name cards with the person sitting nearby, we'll later send around a survey where you can join. It's an opt-in spreadsheet where you can get the information of everybody that you put in, basically all the information on your just name, where you work, what you're interested in, what your expertise is, how you want to be contacted. If you do, if you don't want to, that's fine. But if you do opt in, you can see everybody else's contact, and it's cumulative. So we've gone through a bunch of these public forum series with people who can speak in very high depth areas. So how to use data in your decision making by Google, this was last week, and others more broadly, 30 years of experience dealing with Japanese firms in Silicon Valley, lessons from that. We also conduct research of all sorts. What are the startups here? What are the lessons of, we'll leave to the consultants what the best practices, what are the worst practices? That's what a university is useful at uncovering. And other things like policy analysis and implementation. And we have a variety of collaboration for research activities with Japanese universities, parts of the EU, and our wonderful friends UC Berkeley across the bay. So the panelists. We have Joanna Drake Earl, who's a general partner at Core Ventures Group, Gen Isayama, the co-founder and CEO of World Innovation Lab, and David Swanson, Executive Vice President of HR for SAP SuccessFactors. And it's more interesting if panelists introduce themselves as they talk about their first points. So managing open innovation, lessons from harnessing Silicon Valley.
Okay.
So you want me to start?
Yeah, you can hop in.
Well, I'm so pleased to be here. The last time I was in this building, I was a master's student, and I was literally walking my thesis paper down the corridor to my two advisors, Professor Okimoto and the previous U.S. ambassador to Japan, Michael Armacost, and it was all about trepidation and heart thumping. So it's nice to be here today without all that stress. Thank you for having me. If there are two big themes in my personal and professional life, one is about US-Japanese relationships, mostly geared towards professional, and the other is about innovation. So to speak to the former, it's been a little bit of a circuitous journey, but I had my first exposure to Japan living there as a child when my father was transferred to run PepsiCo Japan, the ripe age of 8, and got a fantastic first introduction to Japan. It lit a fire of curiosity and passion, which led me to later in my educational years focus on the Japanese industrial state at UC Berkeley, spend a year studying at Keio University in Tokyo, living with a Japanese family, and then studying here my master's, focused actually on keiretsu and their foreign direct investment strategies. For a variety of reasons, which I'll come back to, I then began to focus on serial startups. But years later, I was recruited out of my last startup to become the COO of the Western operations for one of the leading Japanese public mobile companies, DNA. And it was a fantastic experience for me to re-engage with Japan, particularly in the area of trying to take a series of acquisitions that had been made, starting in Silicon Valley, but in many other parts of the Western world, and working with the founders and the board and the executive team to think about post-merger integration and how to take various startups and mash them together into a very successful entity as a whole. So I'm happy to speak to that at great length today. After I left DNA, it became clear to me that my next chapter needed to be portfolio management, not just building companies from scratch. And I ended up, after considering lots of options, joining one of the few Japanese national entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. His name is Shinya Akamine. Like me, he had 4 VC-backed startups, several hugely successful exits. He started our group, Core Ventures Group, in 2012. And we are a seed stage venture group and have a very strong base of Japanese investors who we work closely with, because part of our theory is to bring startups to Japan, and you need warm partners to do that. Backing up just very quickly, my innovation chapter was after leaving Stanford. I joined Booz Allen in Hamilton, spent 5 years focused on Hollywood media and entertainment and Silicon Valley tech, which began a series of serial startups, 3 to be exact. And the most well-known was a company called Current TV, co-founded with Vice President Al Gore and Joel Hyatt, a serial entrepreneur. And we created with Current TV the first social media company before there was a category called social media. We established cable distribution, and I built the first online production studio to enable citizen journalism and user-generated content on television, first in the United States and then throughout Europe.
Great, thanks.
Wow. That's a great experience. I don't know what to talk. So I'm Kenji Isayama, co-founder, CEO of World Innovation Lab. Before I started this firm, I came to Stanford, again, like Joanna did in 2001. So I've been here for 15 years. Prior to starting Will, I was with a venture capital firm called DCN for 10 years, investing in tech companies, helping them enter Japanese market, and 3 years ago, I started Will with one idea to create a paradise for corporate entrepreneurs. So that was my mission. And my idea came when I learned about Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. Maybe it's not too familiar with all of you people here, but it was Lockheed Martin is an airplane, they make aircraft, and there was a division called Skunk Works where there was a small group inside of an organization which was allowed full autonomy, and they can ignore the bureaucracy in the big company to try interesting project. They call ADP, Advanced Development Program. So there was a small set of group inside of gigantic organization which had this liberty to try cool stuff. And I said, well, this is a great idea. I think all Japanese corporates should be adopting this idea. And no one seems to be doing it. So I said, maybe I should start one. There's another idea which I was following as a graduate student here, was a company called Idea Lab down in South California. In the Founder Bureau Growth, basically it set up this lab, Idea Lab, which his mission was just to keep on incubating a lot of companies. I think he incubated dozens and dozens of dot-com companies, and some of them are very successful. And the idea was, I think they called it Venture Studio. So it was meant to set up companies. If you had a great idea, let's start a company and see whether it works. And kind of combining these two ideas together, I thought, maybe I could set up an organization for big companies to take risk and try new, try some ventures without worrying about your boss or your budget, everything like that. So that's how World Innovation came into place. So with the idea, I was funded by, fortunate to be funded by a lot of people here from the audience, Sony, Nissan, 7-Eleven, Daiwa, Mizuho, list goes on, and I raised about $360 million in a very big fund for the first venture. Yet I can see a lot of people had high expectation on this new version, Japanese version of the skunkworks method. And so I've been doing this for about a little bit over 2.5 years. Most of our activities are related to helping corporate innovation, one of which is investing in actually startups. By investing in startups, I basically introduce them to corporates so that they can learn a lot from early stage startups. Also, we do a lot of spin-outs and incubation, as it was my original interest. It takes a lot of time and effort, but it starts to work. It seems to be working, and we also know that 1 or 2 success in Japanese society would make everyone follow. So I'm trying to get that first one right now. And thirdly, which is it's not a profit-making activity, but we call it education, corporate training education, which actually a lot of the people in this room are here from Tokyo this week to go through this innovation boot camp that we crafted inside of Will. And I think tomorrow we're going to be in SAP lab for an entire day to go through the design thinking, which is a big boom in Japan right now. It originally came out from SAP's founder's idea. So that's what we are, and I'm very excited to talk about how different people on this panel view Japanese corporations today, how they can be more creative, innovative, given what's happening in the world. So,
thank you, David.
Good. So, David Swanson, and I'm probably with a company, as I often say to people, it's the biggest company you've never heard of. We're behind the scenes in almost every manufacturing situation around the world. We're a 43-year-old German company, and I emphasize 43 and German. For 2 really important reasons. It was a huge struggle for us to really make the transition to be an innovative company. And for those of you that work for, and I know 40 years in Japanese company history is not that long, it's ancient in the technology world, to try to change behaviors, to believe that everything didn't have to come from the corporate headquarters. So for many years, I joined through an acquisition of a company called Business Objects about 8 years ago. And when we joined SAP, we heard a lot of, well, that doesn't really fit our product portfolio. We don't do it that way here. That's a nice idea, but not really of interest. We'll never make money in doing that. And if we'd listened to all of that, I think we would have, as a company, been near to out of business or been acquired by this point. And subsequently, we've done 5 other fairly large acquisitions of companies I'm sure you've heard of, companies like Ariba, Sybase, Concur, which has a beautiful travel management solution. And the group that I work mostly now with is SuccessFactors, our HR solution. And it really took all 6 of these companies to really start to move the culture from it only can be invented here to we can figure out how to collaborate, not only here, but with partners, with small companies, with mid-size, with large companies and partners. We realized that much of the talent that's entering the marketplace today is not really interested in moving to your corporate headquarters. They're not really interested in leaving behind their family and their friends and moving from China or India or South Africa or wherever they happen to be. And so if you want to access the best talent, and if you don't think having the best talent is the differentiator in your business, you, like a company I once worked for called Nortel, will likely be out of business. Because if you don't get access to the talent that's coming in today that really will drive the innovation agenda for your business and do it in a way that's interesting to them, they'll go find somewhere else. And I would have to say that in the first couple of acquisitions that we did, we lost some really talented people, and some of those people now are running very successful emerging companies. So it was a plus for the technology sector, it was a negative for us because we lost some really bright talent. But what we found is we went out and talked to our employees, and one of my roles at SAP was the head of HR for our entire development organization, which for SAP is not a small group. It's about 25,000 people around the world who develop either current or next generation products. So it's a fairly large and influential group. But what we found with that group was they were really working on a lot of really interesting things, but they weren't really part of the overall strategy of the business. In addition, many of the people who were innovating were people who were stuck in what Clayton Christensen would call the innovator's dilemma, where you only know what you know in front of you. And so we had to go find ways to bring people in and get them to stay at SAP to really innovate for the next generation of products. As we've moved from an on-premise solution to a cloud solution, product life cycles are 6 to 12 months. In the on-premise world, product life cycles can be 10 or 15 years. That took a huge cultural change within SAP, and one of the ways we did that, really two ways we did that, is we set up innovation centers around the globe. So we went where the talent was and set up innovation centers and have really given those centers the freedom to come up with products and solutions that are of value to their customer base. So the customer base in China has a certain need that's very different from the customer base in Europe. If we design products with Europeans, we'll never make the Chinese marketplace. In addition, we found as we talked to our employees that they told us, you know what, when we innovate around here, we do it on the weekends. We do it quietly. We do it in a back room with the doors closed. And we asked them in focus groups, why is that? We give you time. We give everybody time to go innovate. They said, well, when we innovate, all of a sudden the marketing people show up and the IP attorneys show up, and pretty soon we're answering questions to all these people who are holding us back. So about 4 years ago, we started actually here in Palo Alto with the very first center that we called the App House. This is sort of a play on German words, but we rented a building over in Los Altos, much like Google did when they take teams and take them off campus, because we realized that having them on campus was not helping them. So we sent them off and we said, you know what, you can work on anything. The only thing you need to do is report in every 30 days and tell us what you're doing. And so today, one of the most successful products that exist in SAP today is a product called SAP HANA. Hopefully you've heard of that product because we spend a huge amount of money marketing that product. But it is really revolutionizing how data is stored in the data storage business. And it would never have happened had we not taken these groups, pulled them out of the traditional workplace, and give them that freedom to basically innovate without somebody looking over their shoulder. The real challenge that companies face, because a lot of companies do that, they send people off to different locations, they say, hey, go do cool things, is how do you bring that back into your culture? Because to send them out but not bring them back to your culture is not a sustainable solution, particularly a company of 75,000 people like we are. So we've now figured out how do we bring those people back and celebrate what they've done versus tell them, you know, what you're doing is really different, not really in our way. And we had people tell folks that were in the HANA product. They said, you know what, you're building a product that will kill SAP. This is not something we do. We're a software company, not a hardware company. The reality is HANA is software, but it's software that's taking the place of a lot of hardware that's out there. And had we let them listen to those people, we would have likely lost that team and they would have innovated the product somewhere else and somebody else would have that success today.
David, how do you reward them compensation-wise?
So we broke the bank on that one, and I was the HR person that got to do that. We said, if you were in a startup and you were successful, what would your equity position look like? So we created equity, actually in some cases more equity than some of our most senior people had, which as you can imagine didn't go over very well, particularly some of our German leaders. And we gave them the opportunity to really break the bank, and the group that was about 40 actually enjoyed a really successful payoff. But the more important thing is those people are still with us today because they felt like you believed in us and you rewarded us, but it nearly cost me my life to get that equity program approved. But we realized to be successful, we had to think the same way. Now it's a little different because the risk is different in a company of our size, but still we wanted to reward those people. So we have separate reward systems now. We also do a lot of work for some, you'll have a chance to see tomorrow with SAP Ventures, where we're working with emerging companies. We also do a lot of work with a group we call Startup Focus, where we're out working with very young companies, introducing them to our software, letting them use our software for free, giving them access, much like an incubator would, to talented people that can help them stay focused on innovating, not on how to run the business. And that's helped us out as well. But as a big company, you have to really think differently to make it work.
So Joanna, I'm curious, you've been in the front lines too, so your experiences and thoughts around how to reward people, what to do with personnel after M&A, things like that.
Yeah, so I have a lot of different frameworks to comment. One is when you're approaching from outside Silicon Valley, how to think about the initiatives and the opportunities. But once you've decided to do M&A, and you're faced with the challenge of integrating two very different cultures, both sometimes big companies, startup, but in one of my experiences, Japanese corporate and Western, mostly Silicon Valley based, there's certainly a lot of challenges. You know, a lot of, one of the most strategic insights I think that I had, hopefully many others have had it, is when you mash up a Silicon Valley startup ecosystem with some of the best talent, particularly on the technical side, one of the challenges is for the Japanese parent or partner to understand that in order to inspire our talent here to do the impossible every day in these startups, to climb that huge mountain from a very small front base, you generally have to have a very dynamic leader who stands at the front of the troops and says, we're going to climb that mountain, we're going to do it together, and that is the mountain, and here we go. It tends to be a very singular strategy, and if they articulate the market logic is there, then you can galvanize the troops, and indeed you can do some impossible things. But it so often happens here that you're a quarter up the mountain and something has changed in the marketplace, or you've had some insight about your product, or some technology is not working, and then you realize, oh my gosh, this is the wrong mountain to climb, in which case you have to change course, and the leader has to be strong enough and have enough trust and dynamism to get the troops to go to the next mountain. And here that's called a pivot, and we all assume it's going to happen over and over and over again with startups, and even in big companies when you're pursuing new product lines. Meanwhile, what I learned working with one of the more progressive and intelligent-minded tech companies from Japan, what is true for them and many other Japanese companies is that, and could be true for large companies in general, there's not a belief in a singular strategy. Oftentimes there's a notion that let's have multiple pathways climbing, maybe multiple hills or going at the same hill in different ways. And it's not as critical for the Japanese workforce necessarily to have a dynamic visionary standing at the front of the room saying, we're going to do this because we're going to be the best at this or that or achieve that goal. Instead, they seem to be as comfortable pursuing certain corporate metrics and knowing that their teams are going to be parallel processing and someone is going to be successful getting there. I think the challenge in some of the cultural mashup comes when the Western teams fail, and then they are brought to the table to get more resources to go in a different direction. There's a sense, of all of you that work in Japanese companies know that you actually have to have responsibility for not achieving your goal, and you need to come to the table and you need to apologize and you need to own it. But so many of our Western folk here don't really see a pivot as not a failure. It's actually just heading in a different direction and don't know the importance of apologizing. And if that connection and that trust building doesn't happen, it can break down very quickly. And meanwhile, it's important for Western groups to realize it's not so much about that single strategy. In fact, I found that strategy doesn't have the same meanings in Japanese business culture, at least in my experience. And yet it's viewed as actually not very intelligent to not have lots of parallel pathways to get there. So that was a very strategic insight. There are a lot of other tactical things, who your boss is really matters here. Most oftentimes people are leaving companies in order to follow an individual, and that person oftentimes mentors and caretakes their career. So unlike a Japanese organization where you can have lots of changing bosses and you can have lots of changing roles and you kind of do what you're asked to do, you can't, one of the experiences I had is you can't fax over a change in an org chart and have a VP understand that they have a new boss in Tokyo tomorrow without any context and information, because usually that ends up being a retention challenge. So I think, two insights to share are just the difference in the importance of strategy here in galvanizing troops versus having multiple pathways in a Japanese corporate or frankly in a larger company. And then the importance of these human relationships from a reporting and boss perspective and allowing that mentorship and retention issues to be solved for by individual leaders here.
Fascinating. So we're touching on all sorts of areas here. So changing corporate culture when we're bringing in new firms from the outside. If you're SAP, if you're big, if you're a Japanese firm coming here, the same words might mean different things. Mm-hmm. And then how to manage that internally. So again, given that one of the things that you're doing is taking ideas and technologies from big companies and spinning them out in various forms, what do you have in terms of what you bring to the table for?
Yeah, I think I think the idea, I guess, was great. Otherwise, no one was going to invest in my new venture. But I think I'm facing a few obstacles that I have to overcome, which I kind of know what to do, but it still takes a lot of time. I think the first major obstacle working with any Japanese organization is this notorious ringi system or the job rotation system. Ringi system, in my mind, is a system where people keep on passing responsibility such that at the end of the day, no one wants to try something adventurous. So that's the ringi system, right? I mean, it feels like it's working, but as you pass the information along to get approval, you can't do anything adventurous. And that's very bad. Also, combined with that system, job rotation system, which everyone here in this room have to switch divisions every 3-4 years or every 5 years, makes it impossible to take any risk, because when you take the risk, you need a lot of guts, but you never get to see the outcome of it within such a short period. So it's kind of doesn't make any sense for anyone smart to take risk in that job rotation mechanism. So I think those were one of the areas that we need to solve. And one way to do it is obviously creating this extraterritorial like will, where people can go in and out wherever they are, such that when they start something risky, the project get taken care of by someone else outside, such that whenever they want to come in, they can come in and they can leave. So that's one area. I think the second big issue that we face is not just with Japanese, but the organizational inertia as a big organization. And this is not just again, U.S. company also face. I know that SAP faced a lot of organizational inertia, but figure out a way to spark innovation ideas inside of big companies. I think again, to do it, we have to figure out a method to identify people who has great ideas, who is willing to take risks. I think issue about, I was talking this morning as well, but is that, you remember when you're small and you're like in elementary school or high school, there's always 1 or 2 kids in your classroom who likes to mess things around. Those are the people in the organization who can take risks, who we need to, find out what the ideas they're thinking about, because if you're only trying to pick the most well-rounded, well-behaved, teachers, favorite students, I don't think you can create innovation. So we have to figure out a way to surface that spark that someone has in the organization. I think I had one more. Let me think. Oh yeah. So the last part is more about emotion. I think Japanese, unfortunately, I think the education and entire this corporate system is built to fear of failure. I think feeling failure. But I guess it's not just Japanese thing. Everyone hates to fail. But I think in Silicon Valley, we focus more about failure, fear of missing out something great. I think fear of failure is okay because everyone has that. But I think if the fear of missing something great is greater than the fear of failing, I think people can start to take risk. I think that mindset is somewhat, making some of the people in Japanese organization, they're all creative, they're all willing to, they have guts to take risk, yet sometimes the value system is not there to embrace, hey, world is changing so fast. If you miss out on this trend, you're going to regret more, and it's much more painful than making a failure. So I think those 3 elements are the obstacle I have to face every day. Every time I try to do something creative, I have to go to the CEO, I have to go through the middle management, I have to persuade the younger guys. But I think fundamentally, every element is there in the society. It's a matter of how can I change that, make the first motion such that everyone says, okay, that's the way to do it. And once we have a role model, we all know that Japan is very good at modifying and making it better. So.
Well, there are a few cultures more fear of failure, I think, than the German culture. So it's very much, you always need to get the right answer. So the big challenge for us was, how do you reward this idea of failing fast? And so we used a couple of ideas. One was lean methodology, which encouraged you to try things in short sprints. If they don't work, learn from those and move forward. And the other was design thinking, where you really step out from what you think is right to what your customer actually needs to get done. And those 2 things, with the help from our founder, who was very adamant that for SAP to stay successful, we had to think differently than we had for the last 25 years. And when you're a company that's doing really well, it's very, very hard to get people to make that change. And so you almost have to do artificial things. And for us, it was setting up some of these groups away from the company. It was probably a number of acquisitions who came in who just by sheer force started changing the culture because there were large groups of people coming in with a different viewpoint. But in the end, you have to help people see a way to win. Because if it's all about you need to change, people will oftentimes entrench themselves much more, and you'll never see that change. And so we had to say to people, you know what, it's okay to think differently, and you actually get rewarded for that. But it was a big cultural shift for us, and it's still a journey that we're on. Even we started it probably 6 years ago, and it'll probably take us another 6 years to get there. And I think, unfortunately, for American companies, they tend to want things to happen in 6 weeks, and you don't change culture in 6 weeks.
So it seems to be a common theme that Silicon Valley can be used as a sort of an external place for culture, ideas, et cetera, that's separate from the headquarters to overcome the sort of innovator's dilemma. And so what Gen was talking about and what David was talking about and Joanna was hinting at, so once you get successfully, let's say you're successful at getting something going very well in Silicon Valley, it's a different culture. Mm-hmm. How do you toe the line between it's so different that it's isolated and then becomes inconsequential because it cannot be reintegrated, or you make it so that it's impactful enough that it will start to change the headquarters? It sounds to me like SAP, the founder was interested. He was converted, and people at the ground level here were interested in new things. This middle area are the people that needed almost like an Othello game to be changed. And Gen, and this is an early stage for Gens because you're still working on this, how to reintegrate. But one of the consistent themes that looking at, say, the DNA case might be what the approach is for making the Silicon Valley excursion to begin with. If you're going to set it up, what are the expectations and what are the potential mechanisms? And there should be several if some of them don't work, of its impact onto your core practices. And that's where personnel becomes key, right? Yep. We've all heard the horror stories of, okay, so there's the headquarters in another country. Yep. There's a wonderful startup here. There are some great people. The salary scales do not match. So we cannot authorize paying 3 times what their boss in the home headquarters is to here. End of story. Okay, we authorize it. Then what do you do with this team if it becomes successful? What do you do if this team has to become a pivot case? And those kinds of issues. So Joanna, did you come across, and I know you work with a lot of LPs that are interested in harnessing Silicon Valley. Are these the kinds of discussions that you have?
Well, I think, I think that question is most geared towards when you are experiencing post-merger integration and really trying to pull back that innovation. I would have stepped back to speak a little bit about even before that. As you mentioned at the outset of this talk, we have seen a resurgence in the last couple of years. I admire Will for so capitalizing on that and setting up some really creative programs to help Japanese companies as they're really genuinely trying to understand innovation and engage. In the last 2 years, my partner and I have probably sat with over 100 executives from major Japanese global corporations and other global corporations. And what we find to be the most helpful discussion as they're contemplating all these possible ways to engage Silicon Valley is a framework for stepping back and really saying, what are we trying to get out of innovation? What is it that is so attracting us? It's hopefully not just Prime Minister Abe pounding the pulpit and saying, go figure out what they're doing. It's hopefully not just their board saying, actually, you better get a bit more defensive because you are going to be disrupted quickly. It's a multifaceted conversation because sometimes it's about just understanding the technology trends coming out of here and being on top of that for your core businesses. Sometimes it's actually a desire to acquire talent where you have capability gaps in your core organizations. It could be data analytics as a very well-known one coming out of the Silicon Valley. Sometimes it's about needing to have a pipeline of acquisition opportunities. Sometimes it's about wanting to directly invest into startups. There's so many different mechanisms for getting closer to innovation. And what we find is it's instead of having a knee-jerk reaction and sending your best people and opening an office, investing in the Sand Hill Road VC, trying to make an acquisition and trying to do direct investments, you have to stand back carefully and think about what your core goals are. And once you do that, then you can map up against which initiatives make the most sense. For example, unless you're just interested in financial returns, it usually doesn't make sense to invest in a big Sand Hill Road VC, because unless they have a program like Will's, their job is to keep you away from the entrepreneurs so that they can build their companies and be successful, and they don't want to share deal flow. They're rarely successful corporate balance sheet VCs, so starting that this late is actually not a great idea. And we can go through the entire list. The one commonality that we advise every Japanese corporation that we work with all of our investors, is that regardless of what your objective is, develop a trusted Silicon Valley insider human capital network. Because there's a big difference between what the public perception of Silicon Valley is. Stanford, what you read in TechCrunch, forgive me Stanford because I'm alumni, I'm very supportive, but you can't just become part of a program here. You can't just read TechCrunch and show up at XYZ incubator accelerator for demo days, because that's actually all very public, and that's not what's happening in kind of the most high talented serial entrepreneur worlds and in the closest, most guarded deal flow. So in order to get beyond what's public and start, whether it's understanding trends or having access to high quality deal flow or having access to high quality startups, you actually need to get into the insider network, because it's those trusted people that will give you the right introductions, that can act as a filter for the right people and the right companies and the right opportunities. So that's how we usually start our conversations. Getting to the post-merger integration and how to pull back innovation is a bit far down the road, but that's the most helpful. And then we always, and I won't go into detail here, but we always find that one of the most helpful lists is what you shouldn't do in Silicon Valley.
Let me talk to you about that later, the what not to do, because that's great. And there's a lot of them, and they're very common. So the key theme of creating insiders, this is absolutely critical, and it goes right to the heart of personnel, because what we see, and much of our frustrations, right? People will be sent from companies that have wonderful technology, wonderful potential, great people come for 3 years. First year, figure out the lay of the land. Second year, do some work. Third year, time horizon is shrinking. Even though the company might be a longer time horizon, the person's time horizon is shrinking, so nobody's going to talk to them because everything's going to be reset. And one of the worst practices, maybe number 6 out of 15 or so that I have in my head now are, and then the next person comes, but they don't know who the previous person was. So we're sitting here, nice to meet you, goodbye, it's been wonderful. New person comes, so how does Silicon Valley work? And you say, so you think we're going to tell you this for free time and time again? Well, the people who are not doing it for free will have even less time, or else. Anyway, so the question is how to create insiders. But then if you're not on the 3-year promotion cycle, or 5 years at the longest, very few people are longer than that, then you go back to the headquarters and you say, well, you've been away so long, you're now a Silicon Valley person, you're not really part of our culture. How do you do that? And I'm curious for the case of SAP, how that kind of thing is managed. And again, what kind of solutions you're providing. One interesting solution that's not necessarily duplicable or sustainable is you have one person who has a lot of, a big budget in their pocket, they can do deals, and for the coordination between home office and here, they just spend 180 days, 179 days of the year for visa reasons here, and the rest in Japan, and they go back and forth every couple months. But if that person, I don't know how long that's sustainable for until we have faster airplanes and a cure for jet lag, I don't know how that works. So at a more systemic level, how do we manage the creating insiders and making sure the insiders in Silicon Valley are insiders within the company too?
Right.
How do we do that?
I think you have to redefine what it means to be an employee. I think the traditional view of an employee who's going to work for you for 3 to 5 to 10 years is rapidly changing. What we're finding in probably the tipping point for us in innovation was co-innovation. We went out with our partners and our customers, and what was historically very much of this is our IP, we aren't going to release it, has now merged to this is our IP to share with you to figure out how we can come up with solutions that benefit not only you, but your customer ecosystem as well. And getting beyond those fences, while it's a struggle to get there, is really, I think, the success for most organizations. Because if you think you can do it alone, you're dreaming. And if you think your definition of an employee or an insider is somebody who's on your payroll, then you're going to really struggle. Because so many people today that do work for us don't get a paycheck from SAP. They're either freelancers, they're entrepreneurs, they're customers that we co-innovate with, they're partners that we co-innovate with. So it's really taking that ecosystem and casting the net much wider than historically many companies have done, I think, regardless of whether you're from Europe, the US, or Asia. And that, I think, has been a big change that I've seen with companies here that are successful. If you look at the companies who've really figured out how to re-innovate, frankly, companies that were struggling even just a couple of years ago, they've really figured out how to open up their whole ecosystem to a much broader base. And that's where I think it has to be, because you just can't own all the talent. You can't expect people, particularly early talent coming into the business, to say, well, I'm going to do everything I'm going to do with you, and And you can't expect many of your acquired employees to stay. If you think you're going to get them for 3 to 5 years, then you're on the wrong track. I mean, the goal really should be how can you get them integrated into the business and get them into the key parts of the business quickly, but know that you might only have 6 to 12 months to do that before you've lost that. And they see something else, particularly here in this market, they see something else. Because what you get here is, well, I don't like my manager, and so I'm going to go find a job somewhere else. What you get in the rest of the world is I don't like my manager, so I'm just going to wait a while till she passes by and somebody else will take their place, but I'm not going anywhere. It's a very upside down model that exists in this market. I can't tell you the number of people who tell me, I had a bad day, I'm going to go look for a job somewhere else. It's like, well, maybe you need to stick it out a little bit more. So.
Yeah, so when I think about how do you, now we have a fancy facility in downtown Palo Alto. People come here, I guess people are happy to be in this nice weather, exciting, every day is exciting. How does that affect the headquarters side? If it doesn't change anything, my project fails. So I take it very seriously. And a couple of ideas I had, or a couple of things that I really studied really hard about when I think about how do you create a headquarter adopt this Silicon Valley-like mentality. So one idea was, let's take Taylor Swift. Everyone knows Taylor Swift today. But when she started as a singer, she was singing in a nightclub at Nashville. No one cares, right? You have to start from a small group. And it's almost like building a fan base. You have to start from small location. You're going to find several fans of what you're doing. And they eventually become a fan, and the word of mouth spreads out. So one thing what we do literally today is we invite corporate executives to come to our Palo Alto office for 1 week. We do this 1-week boot camp to learn about innovation in general, and I guess tomorrow we're going to be in SAP to learn about SAP method. By having that, we're not just doing this to educate. I think this is for us to create fan base for Will. I mean, the more fans go back to the headquarters, better for us, because once you have more people who understand what we're trying to do, it's only going to help us. So I think that you need to keep doing that. It takes time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of our partners, sleepless nights. But someone has to do it, and someone has to make that an effort to do these small events from time to time, so that you're going to create a very sticky fan base. And I don't think there is a fancy magic to make people happy overnight. So that's one. Another one I joke around is that I really studied about religions, how religious leaders create an empire out of their ideas. When you think about successful business, it's almost like religion. People believe, like Joanna said, you follow the people. So you almost need to understand why these new religion keeps on coming up with massive fan base. And I'm curious, they must be a super successful entrepreneur if they start a business. So learning about how religion starts and how people follow religions, I mean, I'm just kind of using this as an analogy, but it makes us wonder. I think at the end of the day, you have to, people in the core organization has to have a passion about what you're doing. So finding a sponsor at the higher, board level CEO and the headquarters is very important. My side, the Silicon Valley side, must have a very, passionate people around us, such that that passion kind of gets transferred after they go back to the headquarters. So I think those two studies gave me a lot of insight about how do you create a fan base, and then the kind of question I get, or counterback I get, is again, okay, that sounds nice, but I'm worried that people who go to your office are going to leave my company and start a startup or join a startup. I said, don't worry. If people want to jump out after they get exposed to Silicon Valley, culture, they should be doing it. I'm not going to encourage them to jump out of the company, because then I lose my job. But if they leave, who cares? Think about them being alumni to your organization. They're going to be eventually your source of success, and that's what we call here a mafia. Facebook mafia, PayPal mafia. Those are the alumni who spent some time in your organization and went out to start a startup, and every one of them has a deep respect to every organization they came from. And I think that's an ecosystem that you want to create. I think in Japan, we all know that when someone leaves, we ignore them. We almost completely shut the door for them to even enter the building, physical building, which doesn't make any sense. I kind of understand the emotional, frustration when the best people leaves, but you kind of have to embrace that and think long term. Hey, if he or she is very successful, it's only going to benefit you. So I think those things combined, I think we're finding some solution to make this work. And as everyone said, the world is changing so fast. So I think if we were to change something, it has to be now.
It's interesting you mentioned that because actually a lot of companies are investing heavily in alumni programs because they realize that value of the ecosystem that's out there.
Yeah, by the way, most Japanese companies, alumni association is hidden. It's like, it's a hidden URL with a password protected list, and no one can access unless you become alum. So it's very bizarre when you see it. There's alum community is so big, yet headquarters doesn't even recognize it. And
there's such a lost opportunity in cultivating real previous employee alumni, as both of you are saying. I also like, David, your notion of an extended alumni base, if they were passing through or their partners, to the extent that you create this, again, what we call a trusted human capital network. It's so important to model behavior, to make connections. But I also just have to say it because we are in the middle of a downturn here. It's also critical for defensive reasons. We've been watching, starting since last spring, most of the top venture capital firms have been telling their companies to buckle down. We're going to have a long winter. Additional fundraising is not coming. And in fact, we've seen most of the traditional VC investments dry up in the last, call it at least 12 months. Meanwhile, 44% of capital, particularly late stage funding, has been coming from outside of Silicon Valley and even from outside the United States. So we continue to see funding happening, but we're in a period that we call the falling knife period. Because what's really happened is those founders who have not built sustainable businesses that can't get to profitability on their own or have reasonable trajectories are not getting financing from around here. And they're in a desperate phase where they're looking outside of Silicon Valley for additional capital. And it's at this point where they will turn to foreign money and take it very happily in even non-traditional terms in order to sustain their businesses or their valuations. And so we see this with a lot of our limited partners a lot. We get a lot of phone calls now. We have this really amazing opportunity to look at this really hot deal right now. It's a Series C, and none of the Sandhill roads are coming in for their pro rata. Usually that is not a good sign, but it's now when a lot of the non-entrenched, well-intentioned players in the ecosystem, if you don't catch the falling knife exactly by the right handle, it's very dangerous. And it's in these periods that you actually have to have a trusted network that can take the phone call and say, you know what, that company is not in good shape. I would not consider putting an investment. I would not acquire it right now. Have you looked at the track record of the founders? It's in times like these that I would argue you actually even the value of that trusted human capital network that understands what's going on in the markets within the actual companies and can give you that trusted advice so you don't make big mistakes.
That's great. So, yeah, and in times of scholars that have studied cycles of a bubble and bust in Silicon Valley have always noted that it's always at the end of each cycle where a lot of sort of foreign corporate venture capital come in, and that's usually the stage. So then the bad news is that if you're one of those corporate venture capitals, then it's dangerous, possibly, but the good news might be that if there's not as much froth, then it's harder to invest in all the froth that's out there because it's not there anymore.
So when we get to the rebirth phase, it's going to be great for everyone.
Right.
So we're not there yet.
So so
beware the falling knife.
Right. And I'm not investing, but yeah, if you dodge the knives, you're great, because then what you probably don't want to do is buy high and sell low. So you come in when everybody wants to come in, and then when everybody's starting to the froth is sort of dissipating, then you pull out because you're scared, but you've just bought high and sold low. But this leads to an important point that I think all of you are circling around, which is goals and how to formulate them. So Joanna, you were saying it's important to have goals that work and to know your goals so that you can sort of move towards those goals. So then the question is how to formulate the goals that are realistic. Because one common complaint is foreign companies will come in and expect Silicon Valley is like a treasure hunt. There's a nice treasure box here, there's a nice treasure box here, we can go in and find those and buy these and we'll all be happy. That's probably not a realistic expectation. So who's going to tell you what's a realistic expectation? That's the insider network. How do you dodge the knives? It's the insider network. How do you take people from within the organization that might not fit, but put them in a place like Silicon Valley that works really well, like what Gen is doing. And how do you assess those people? Because the people in headquarters, that's not the same type of people that are the people that would succeed here, is what you were saying between the lines. So it does lead to creating insiders, right? And so Silicon Valley really is a history of outsiders becoming insiders, people who were no-name people coming and making a name for themselves, doing interesting things. Elon Musk came from South Africa with a backpack to his relatives in Canada, but they had moved to the US. He finally got here, and then he made himself. Now he's an insider. This keeps happening wave after wave after wave for at least 70 years. So if you're sitting outside Silicon Valley, and you're, let's say, a big Japanese company, and you're thinking, okay, we need to access insider networks, other than talking to you, what are some of the mechanisms available, do you think?
It's a great question. I'm going to suggest one example and some general tactics. One example for us is we've worked closely with Recruit strategic partners because I'm sure they've had several experiences, but they had one experience in particular where Groupon showed up in their Japanese market and started calling on their customers, and they were starting to get calls from their customers saying, should I do this Groupon deal? And that was how they learned about Groupon in Japan, and they'd already gotten a pretty entrenched base pretty quickly. So it really scared them, and they made a commitment very quickly to get closer to Silicon Valley so that this doesn't happen again. And they formed a venture group here. They have some really talented members who have been coming through and doing direct investments. But one of the things that they were very humble and very smart about first is when they first came, they said, okay, we actually don't know what we're doing in direct investments. We know what the long-term strategic objective is, to be on top of technology trends, to build a moat around our core business in Japan, to understand new opportunities to either invest and acquire or be present outside. But the business of venture capital we understand to be a complex one that actually usually requires insider networks, and we're starting from scratch. So part of what they did is for their first couple of years, they invested in other funds, and they went to all the LP conferences, and they had regular meetings, very carefully cultivating their own network of contacts in Silicon Valley and doing some joint investments and watching the other funds and learning and absorbing. And fast forward, I think they've done a very good job of studying the market and have a presence and a pipeline and have made that transition intelligently. It's taken a period of investment. That's a very specific example, but we spent a lot of time talking about things not to do, which include when you send executives here, please have a longer term commitment. I think we've all been talking about that. If you're sending someone for a year or 2 years, they're going to go have Meishi meetings. The person on the other side of the table may take the meeting because of the big corporate name or because it's a favor to someone, but they're never going to connect with you. And unless that person comes to a meeting, first of all, takes a meeting with an entrepreneur only when they have an objective. Please don't take tour meetings. That's just a waste of people's time. But if you have a real objective, also do your homework and come to the meeting. We like to say, think of it as a first date. Bring flowers. Bring an insight from your market or your industry or an offer to make an introduction or have an initiative with your company that adds value to the entrepreneur on the other side. And that way you can actually start forming a relationship, and you can have a social meeting afterwards and then another business meeting, and you have more of a framework than just having a Meishi exchange. That's important. So give them a longer runway. Encourage them to come very prepared to cultivate a relationship, not just have a transactional introduction session. Those give Japanese corporations and also other global corporations the worst names in Silicon Valley, because the entrepreneurs all talk to each other and they don't want to take those meetings anymore. They don't have time. And then other things, we see this in particular with Japanese expats, but others. They all tend to live in the same neighborhood, go to the same Japanese restaurant at night, share deal flow if they're doing direct investments. When we talk to our co-investors, which are Crunch Fund and USVP and a lot of the big brands, we're constantly asking them, have you ever seen a Japanese corporate VC or venture fund on your lists? And the answer is usually no. But if you look at, I don't want to name names, but other of the kind of Japanese boutique venture funds or corporate, usually they all have the same startups on their lists. And so, you know, that's existing above this insular human capital insider network. And the job of anyone coming here to engage should be to penetrate that and not cohabitate in the same circles with the same networks and the same contexts. So those are just a couple of, you know, practical tactics on how to penetrate the environment here and be successful. It's just like I lived in Roppongi as a child, but God forbid, please don't make me go hang out in Roppongi with the gaijins anymore. I'll do a much better job if I'm in Shibuya or Daikanyama or somewhere. I'm probably not using the right neighborhoods.
So one theme for using Silicon Valley, the black ships are coming, right? This is the historical reference to the Commodore Perry, the American that opened up Japan in the mid-1800s. Well, instead of waiting for the ships to come, let's go figure out what they're doing in the shipbuilding yard, which is Silicon Valley. But remember, Commodore Perry was a trader, so you got to bring something to trade with, or else you won't just walking around and you can't.
Analogy.
They won't let you in and figure out what they're making. Can I switch gears a little bit, because there are a lot of pitfalls for coming to Silicon Valley, and goal formulation is not easy. But what are some advantages of being from outside Silicon Valley? In other words, what are some weaknesses or needs for Silicon Valley? In particular, what are some advantages of being Japanese, for example? Even if they're not realized yet, what are some of the potentials out there? By the way, this is all ad lib, ad hoc, so time to think while I babble on and make the question longer.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, I think being, you know, being based out of Silicon Valley is that you get this gaijin premium every time I go to Japan, meaning everyone view you as like a tech expert. And I always try to, you know, force myself to learn hard and act like one, but sometimes I feel I get an unnecessary premium rather than living in Tokyo. If I were living in Tokyo, meaning I may not be able to meet this person, but since I live in Palo Alto, they said, oh, again, he's coming from Palo Alto, so let's meet. And there's a little bit of time schedule. You know, since I live here, I'm the visitor. That's why they treat me nicely, things like that. But I feel there's a gaijin premium, like you said, you know, gunboat diplomacy kind of situation where Japan, I think from a history point of view, is somewhat prone to foreign, cool stuff coming from foreigners. And I get treated as a foreigner, even though I was born and raised in Japan. So that's a nice thing to be in Silicon Valley, and I'm trying to use that bias or premium in a very healthy way. You can always abuse it, but I have to use it in a healthy way to achieve my goal. That's one. You know, for me, you know, since I was born and raised in Japan, you know, the fact that I can, you know, drink and sing in karaoke helps me a lot to win trust. You know, sometimes people say, hey, gang, how did you raise so much money and get all these going? And there's so many people who are qualified. And I said, I agree. You know, maybe because I can drink and sing, and maybe I can work 24 hours like typical Japanese big corporate. That's why they may like me. And I think sometimes there is the cultural context that I think, Joanna, by living in Japan, I know there's so many, you know, nonverbal communications that happens in the society. You know, again, I can also read the text floating in the air. You know, we read kukiyomu, things like that, which is extremely important doing business in Japan. In US, you have to text everything. You have to write everything. Even so legal document in Japan and here looks completely different. So the skills that I acquire by living in the Japanese culture sometimes help me a lot by being a gaijin, a foreigner here in the Valley, because somehow they kind of maybe trust me a little bit more than others, just because I can act like, you know, I am a Japanese, so I can completely understand and resonate how they're feeling about taking risks and why they are excited yet not ready to jump into Silicon Valley, things like that. I can completely understand the emotional dynamics that goes into executives, middle management, and younger people, and try to give a best solution based on the rank and the age and the family composition, things like that. I think those small things are extremely important when I'm trying to make a major, you know, impact from outside of Japan, because we all know that Japanese corporations have a huge, you know, long history and big legacy that, you know, it's not very easy to change corporate culture. So that's kind of, I'm trying to use my dual face in a very positive way. That's the only way I can survive. You know, if I talk about just tech, There's so many smarter people on Sand Hill Road, and they're just so much better and qualified than I am. But the fact that I can switch faces and make productive communication with Japanese corporates, maybe that's one advantage I have by being like a dual citizen right now.
I think in terms of weaknesses of this market, it's the capital of short attention span. And by that I mean people have lots of great ideas, but they not necessarily have the energy and the drive and the passion to see it through. People are focused on things that are not sustainable, like making a lot of money, which is not a goal that I think is very valuable, but yet it's a big goal that exists in this valley. I think there are things that in the Japanese culture that are very valuable. This idea of longer term thinking, I think, is very valuable. I think this idea of passion is very valuable. And then the last point I guess I would leave is that while this is a truly amazing place and like no other in the world I've traveled, it doesn't own all of the innovation. There is amazing innovation going on in places like Berlin, in Beijing, I'm sure within Tokyo, in Shanghai, in Bangalore. And so while I would say that this is a great market to be playing in, there are other markets you could think about as well.
I might have heard the question a little bit differently, but my interpretation of it was, what can Japanese companies bring to the Valley? And we feel very strongly that in most cases for software companies, enterprise software in particular, the best secondary market once you've gotten your foothold and are doing well in the United States is Japan. It is technically the most advanced, the most educated workforce, sometimes price insensitive, which is really nice. Most of the population is in Tokyo. Once you knock down one brand name company in an industry sector, you can usually get the rest through reference accounts. And so it's a fantastic market. But so often what we see with Silicon Valley startups is when they get to the point of international expansion and the board's sitting around, I won't talk about the characteristics of most boards here, but when their board is sitting around, they are most prone to go to Europe next, and it's because it's more comfortable. They don't face this scary culture with a language that's really hard to interpret and business practices that are very different. And but that's in our experience not a great decision, because there is no one Europe. You have to go to England and Germany and Spain, and you know this better than anyone, and all the regulatory issues across those, and the language and the personnel issues. So we feel strongly that Japan is the secondary best market, and we encourage our startups to go there pretty early in their life cycle. So if you're a Japanese company, as you know well, it's really hard for foreign companies, particularly tech startups in Silicon Valley, to do well on their own. Just like you need a human capital network here, they need warm partners there. And so there's an enormous opportunity to be an insightful advocate, partner, connector, investor in the Japanese market, and I think that's something that you can lead a lot of meetings with in regards to cultivating relationships for companies that might want to go to Japan quickly.
One of my favorite, yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite examples is Yamaha Motors that decided to build a self-driving robot that can drive a motorcycle. Eventually, it's not just a motorcycle, but everything else that has a human interface, like pedals and human interface designed things. And they partnered with SRI and built this robot in about 6 months for a much lower budget than they expected, because there weren't that many big companies out there willing to partner with these, until then, esoteric technology robotics specialists to actually make something. And then with as Mr. Saijo from Yamaha speaks, they were able to reduce the weight of the thing by about 1/2 using Yamaha engineering know-how. So here's an idea, the expertise is here, the conception is interesting, but it wasn't going to happen within Yamaha itself. Headquarters wasn't sure about that, but they were going to do this as that is a skunkworks kind of thing. But then there was technology contribution to that. And it always takes people that are double insiders, like Joanna and then Gen, who maybe the deal is not quite there, but you go take them karaoke in Japan, and then you're here, and they're comfortable with that. What do you see some of the strengths of Japanese companies that can bring and maybe augment some of the challenges or the deficiencies for Silicon Valley? Dave raised a few. Well, you think one more thing that is my favorite example is recently on Kickstarter, we start to see quite a few failures where they raise a couple million and they say, okay, we're going to deliver it, but oh, there's a supplier problem with a Eastern European factory. There's a demonstration. We tried a different supplier, can't get it in time. We're running out of cash. Let us sell it on Amazon first, so the people who put in Kickstarter get it last. People unhappy about this. What if they used a platform that links all sorts of Japanese small, medium firms to that kind of sort of a centralized way to go source some of that manufacturing capability? That's potential. But those platforms don't exist in an internationalized form yet, but there's potential. But you work with the big companies that have lots of technology.
Yeah.
What are some of the...
I think, we talk about the fourth industrial revolution these days, which, represents artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, things like that. And I guess in kind of somehow Silicon Valley takes a lot of attention, and also a company like SAP takes a lot of attention around this software development. But when I was having a meeting with one of the corporate executive in Tokyo a couple of weeks ago, there was a little bit of aha moment. When we feel like we're missing out on these cool technologies, and at the end, big data, you collect data from these different sources, and you crunch the numbers, and then the machine starts to predict what's going to happen next. But after the prediction, that somehow gets used in the real world as an output. And sometimes it's a form of machine, sometimes it's a form of car, when you think about self-driving cars and things like that. What happens when the hardware has a major defect? You're going to start killing people. Even though the intelligence and prediction could be super accurate, if the output, the machine is not functioning as it says, you're not going to get the right output. So he was saying, this was Komatsu's case. There's a chairman of Komatsu, Sakane-san, was saying, hey, again, did you know that we're the only company in the world who can move the dump trucks at 1-inch precision? Because it's very subtle, it's a very subtle motion movement of these oil pumps and things like that. So he said, unless you can move with that precision, all these self-driving algorithm doesn't make any sense, because you're going to see dump trucks hitting all over the place, even though you claim, now the dump truck is humanless. Dump trucks and shovel calls would do all the work for you. Yes, on the software it makes sense, but when the software has to tell a command for shovel trucks and dump trucks to operate, you need that 1-inch or even less precision such that it would do the work for you. And same as robots. People get excited about robots, but the most difficult part is how do you move the motors at that 1 millimeter precision such that it doesn't hit people when you're working with robots. Mm-hmm. And that precision doesn't exist, I guess, in the United States, at least today. And people are having a tough time making even a simple hardware device that we get excited about, because it's very hard to manufacture at a very consistent quality. And I think when it comes to manufacturing, I think Germans and Japanese had a little bit of history there, building, most complicated hardware device, which is automotive cars. I mean, if you think about how complex car is, Japan still owns 30% share globally. So we have that know-how building the high precision hardwares, which is going to be a very key component in this big data, AI, robotics era. So if you think about it, yes, maybe we lost in the software war, but we have to think about what are we good at and what we're going to focus going forward. Otherwise, if we're just following the trend, there's no competitive advantage. But when I look at holistically, there are some areas that Japan could excel, at least if they continue that, front line going forward.
I think that's a key point, is that there are so many unexplored areas out there today, healthcare being a big one that we're just kind of dipping our feet into, this whole idea of Internet of Things and machine to machine, which Japanese manufacturing has been working with for years. So there's an opportunity to be a leader versus a follower in those spaces. When it comes to cars, you could also, I guess, believe like Google and figure you're going to hit people, so put sticky stuff on the front so when you hit them, they don't fly off. But yeah. If you saw that last week. But I think it's this idea that there are so many, for us, probably the two biggest areas that we think are untapped are data within healthcare, and you have all of these machines that are generating data after data after data, but they don't connect to each other. So when you go to the doctor, you have to tell your story. He or she has no idea what else is going on in your life, yet all of that information is out there and could easily be connected. You have to get past privacy issues and things like that. The other area is learning. Learning, we think, is a really untapped area right now, where companies are very much struggling with how do you impart knowledge. And I think if you think about the history of Japan, there's been so much knowledge transfer that's gone on, both from Japanese companies to American companies. When I think of precision, when I worked 10 years for a company that made heads for disk drives, and the only companies that could make high precision positioners were the Japanese companies. No one else could. And so I think that's an area, especially as things get smaller and smaller and more precise, whether it's surgery. I mean, I had a colleague who just went through a massive heart surgery. They went through a slit in his wrist and then up through the veins. And so, I mean, that whole area is all about precision. And that's an area I think could be a huge advantage for Japanese companies.
Yeah, my favorite recent, well, not my favorite recent YouTube video, but one of the most interesting ones was a Chinese ball bearing and a German ball bearing. And you spin it, and the Chinese one goes 4 or 5 seconds, so it's something like that. You spin the German one, it went for something like 95 seconds. It keeps going and going. Price difference is 10x, which, if you can measure these things well, maybe it ought to be more than that, or if more people knew what they were getting and what the potential difference was, the price mechanism would work a little more accurately. So what I'm getting out of this is there are areas that other places, and let's talk about Japan now, are still really good at. There are areas that they're very good at. At the same time, there are other areas that they're not very good at. So how do you make and harness the advantages of Silicon Valley to augment the areas they're not very good at, but not lose sight of the things that they are good at? And this has to be done in a data-driven way, because there's also the fallacy of we are good at manufacturing. There's a lot of very bad manufacturing that happens too. If there's a sort of a belief that everything we make is great, that's a great way to lose competition. But there are things that are really, really great, but they're just underappreciated internationally. So what I'm seeing is, as an ideal case scenario, maybe hang on to things that are really good, that are actually really good, augment with this kind of external way to either keep changing the culture in various interesting ways or get sources of new innovation. But then we probably need to revert to how the Google data scientists that we were talking to last week, who gave a talk here, went. You collect data, you collect the data you want. Based on that, you make predictions. You can make good predictions. But then you have to experiment. And only after you experiment properly, not an experiment to just try something and see how it works, but a controlled type of experiment, repeated. Then you go back to which data you need to collect, this kind of iterative process. If there's anything that the Japanese stereotypically would be really good at, is painstaking repetition of experiments that are designed well, and you have to go through all these details. Doesn't work or gets one, let's try it 150 more times. That's where there's and satisfaction from doing that well. So I'm hoping that we're going to transition towards a hybrid model where we can take the best of multiple worlds. Let's open it up for questions. So if you have a question, this is being video recorded. You don't have to identify yourself if you don't want to, but there are microphones here. So please pop up and just ask a question. Keep talking, it should be okay.
So I appreciate anyway, I'll just speak out.
We can hear you.
So I appreciate the discussion. What I'm still not clear about is really the unique challenge the Japanese companies in particular face, because I think in the US also large corporations face the innovation challenge, and they've taken on the path of having investment arms make investments, and through those investments place bets, and if those bets are paying off, they'll acquire the company and integrate them, and with the knowledge that in fact many of the founders may not last very long within the larger corporation, and that's just the way it is. Much of the discussion today has been around how to integrate the cultures, which I think US companies fail at also. Why is there such an emphasis about integrating the culture when you know there's so many fundamental differences between the larger Japanese companies and the cultural differences and what it is that's really very unique to innovation? I don't know of many, there may be exceptions, but there's very few instances where innovation can be through a flow diagram or through project houses like the one that you mentioned, which is very common in German companies. SAP has got its own, Evonik has its own. These are really exceptions to the rule rather than the norm. Why is there such an emphasis in your discussion around cultural therapy?
That's a great question, and we'll collect a few. And it's partly my responsibility. I should have made it clear. Many of these problems that face Japan are not unique to Japan. They're common to large companies. They're just much more extreme for large Japanese companies. Big companies tend to be slow. Japanese companies tend to be much more slow. Languages tend to be a little different. Large company languages versus startups. In Japan, the language literally is different, and it's a very hard language. And the number of people who can speak English very easily is much more limited than most other advanced industrial countries. And so the baseline assumption was the challenges are similar, but more extreme. Lifetime employment, long-term employment used to be a feature of large US companies, HP way, IBM. It still is part of the way for most Japanese companies. So more extreme personnel difficulty, things like that. We can address these later. Let's collect a few questions first. And you can address anyone you want.
Hi, I have a question about diversity. It's been said that Japan is a pretty homogeneous society, and there are a lot of efforts in Silicon Valley to overcome the lack of diversity, I think. And what are the lessons that we all learned in Silicon Valley, and what are the sort of implications for Japanese society?
So first of all, diversity is a really broad term. So we've learned in our organization that diversity can be generational, can be gender, can be ethnicity, it can be people who are differently abled, it can be people re-entering the workforce. And so when you open up the definition, it really gives you a much broader opportunity to work with. I think unfortunately because of a lot of the rules that exist in the US, diversity is kind of packaged into a very small and narrow focus. And what we've learned is that when you really value diversity as an organization, innovation happens. Because teams that aren't diverse, everybody kind of piles on, says that's a great idea. Nobody steps up and says, whoa, wait a minute. I don't think that's a good idea, because they all kind of have a groupthink. When you have diversity, you have people who are willing, in some cases, and if there's a trust, to step up and say, well, have you thought about? Or that doesn't seem like that's going to work. Or what if we took that idea and combined it with this idea, we'd have a much more powerful outcome. So those people who have the courage to speak up are oftentimes people who come from a diverse background. Sorry, you were collecting questions and I jumped in there.
And Silicon Valley has major challenges for diversity in the sense of women too, right? For management. If you have anything to say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a poster child for diversity at this point, because we're probably in the less than 1% non-white male VC funds out there. And my partner and I experience the challenge and the benefits of it every day because we come from such different perspectives. I think to David's point, diversity from a business case perspective, what you benefit with it, if people truly come from different experiences and different filters and different backgrounds, so that when they go to approach a decision or a problem, they have really different perspectives to bring to the table, and that mashup of different perspectives usually ends up in better business decisions. We've now proven that out, business case study after business case study. And in fact, in my case, my partner happens to be Japanese. While he grew up here, he has a PhD in electrical engineering from Stanford. He's highly technical background, lots of patents. I have a softer education, political economy, and he went into enterprise software, semiconductor software, created this security system that became Google email, and I did mostly media tech, marketplace, consumer. So we're coming at it gives us really broad diversity in the different sectors and different business models we can look at it. But when we come to consider an investment, or how we, in our very hands-on way, we help founders get to the next level of the company, or how to partner, we are bringing such different perspectives to the table that honestly it's quite uncomfortable a lot of the time. But at the end of the day, if you treat each other with respect, hear each other out, then we generally get to logic-driven, better business decisions. And we see that play out across our companies. Those startups that have, all the similar backgrounds of founders, and then struggle to get diversity down the road of whatever ilk. It's really painful for them down the road. So we have a big problem with it in Silicon Valley, as you all have read. We have a lot of initiatives going on, particularly in the female executive arena, because the representation is just awful. But I would say, as a positive side in Japan, you have such an incredible potential female workplace on the gender side to tap and leverage. If I were starting a company, or if I were hiring, and even here we tend to hire Japanese female MBAs because they are fantastic and they are under-leveraged. So I think that's a huge opportunity on the part of Japanese companies, and encourage more of that. I was lucky enough to work with arguably the most successful Japanese businesswoman in the history of the country, and that she set up a company that was incredibly successful entrepreneurially because I think of diverse perspectives.
By the way, we're going to hold a panel here, a program on November 4th and 5th on womenomics and women in the workplace, and we're going to examine a lot of issues. Our panel, let's see, I'm half Japanese, half American. If I were a woman, we'd be perfectly balanced. But yeah.
Jack Mormon, U.S.-Japan MedTech Frontiers. It was about a year ago, Prime Minister Abe was here and announced the Japan Biodesign Program. The fellows are here in Silicon Valley for their externship, and then they will graduate. There are 7 of them from companies. So the question is, maybe you could comment on what their expectations are and what their company's expectations will be when they go back, the 7 that go back into their existing companies, having been away for 9 months learning about unmet needs and other things.
I think, I'm sure the 7 corporates shares this common goal with some of our investors who come to Silicon Valley, let's say this week, 1 week, or some people who spend 3 months, 1 year, 2 years in our firm. I think there's the tough thing about this Silicon Valley debate is that there's no clear answer to this. Mm-hmm. Silicon Valley feels fascinating. Everyone have high hopes about something happening after sending people to Silicon Valley, but as Kenji mentioned, it's all about people. It's nothing magical, or it's not a technology that is helping innovation. It's the people that is leading the innovation. So whoever come here, at the end of the day, when they go back with a lot of conservatism and probably criticism, they just have to keep the motivation high, and that's the only way they can bring back something productive. Because business model and technology just change so fast, and whatever they come up with this 9 months may not be relevant 6 months from now. But I think that passion and drive to do something right, something in a big organization with a resourceful environment, is something that is missing, I see, in the Japanese society overall. I just want to, all I'm trying to do is not to provide any novel skills or techniques. It's all about how can you bring back the passion that you see everywhere here in the Valley. It's nothing special, but when you go to Tokyo, it's sometimes awfully difficult because every media and newspaper is all about hammering these people, whether it's a politician, or whether it's a pop star, or whether it's a business person. Everyone is trying to find some error in everyone, and you're hammering everyone. Even though, so I always think, this sounds so great, but does everyone have to act like a god? That's kind of my conclusion. Like, I feel like if I were to be successful in Japan today, I have to be completely, I literally have to become a god. No faults, not whatsoever. But we all know that we have a lot of failures, and half of our life is about failure. But so it's awfully difficult to even try to do things. But just bringing back the spirit into the organization, I think that has to be the biggest mission. Again, and then something creative may happen, but we just have to keep on doing it. It just adds up in my mind.
Thanks for the great panel. So we learned that there needs to be some kind of a commitment from the upper ranks, senior executives. And let's assume we have that. Let's assume. And as a middle management, maybe some expatriates from Japan sitting here, how can we help his or her initiative to make the innovation within the organization? What can we do practically to help the initiative get bigger momentum in the organization?
Best question ever for the last question of the day. So if we go through and
I have one quick answer to that. I think one request you need to ask the CEO or the executive who sponsored these kind of initiatives is to form a champion inside of the organization. People often just send people out to Silicon Valley and assume something magical happens. But what frustrates most people who come here is that every time you introduce startups or come up with their ideas, no one in the headquarters actually, is responsible to respond to it. I think one of our LP would describe this as a no catcher problem, which you're pitching so many balls to the headquarters and no one catches it. So every ball gets hit on the wall or it just gets dropped. Nothing really happens. So you need, actually, before you come to Silicon Valley and set up a fancy office, you actually need to find a good catcher in the headquarters such that when you go and throw new ideas, they would receive it and bring it back to the CEO. I think that's the biggest missing link I often see with a corporate initiative when they talk about Silicon Valley. They just send a lot of people and invest to VCs and they invest in consultants and things like that. But all those information has no champion in the headquarters. And I think that's the biggest issue that I see. They spend a lot of money and great people, but unless you have someone responsible in the headquarters who ideally have direct report to the CEO, nothing creative or risky happens. That's the truth, I think.
I concur, and I think on a practical level, just extending that one step, when you have people who are representing your brands and your businesses here, and you're serving the role of business development evangelist or partnership identifier, once you find a great technology or a great team or a great partnership opportunity, then to Gen's point, if you can identify the stakeholder in Tokyo who then will become the championship of the deal and unlock resources and partnership initiatives pretty quickly, though, because if that takes a long time, they're going to lose interest and you continue a reputation of not being responsive. And the worst thing that you can say when you're taking meetings, particularly the second and beyond, is I have to call Tokyo and I don't know who. Still haven't figured out who it is that can be my champion back there. So doing that very quickly and making sure that that person is actually holding their hand and saying, I will actually give budget, I will give staff, I will make this initiative a reality. Otherwise, it's probably better to walk away if you don't have that person.
I mean, the hard facts of expat assignments is that over 80% of them lead to that employee coming back to the home company and leaving within 12 months. So 80%. The cost is 3 to 4 times a person's annual salary to send them on an expat assignment, particularly to a high-cost market like here. And the key to success is exactly what both of you have talked about. There has to be somebody that they connect to, because the world changes dramatically in the 2 years that they're gone. In fact, if they worked for SAP, probably 3 or 4 of their managers have come and gone in that period. So if there isn't somebody that's constantly connecting with them, and the organization doesn't have a very, very crystal clear vision for why you're sending that person, then you're going to lose that person when they come back. And oftentimes, if you look on the succession chart, these are your best people. They're the people who are going to become the COO or the CEO. And if you send them off on an assignment without a purpose, you've lost a huge amount of money, and the risk of losing that person as a successor is gigantic. So I think the most successful companies are those that really stop and ask, what are we trying to accomplish? Yes, we want them to go soak up the culture that exists in that particular location, but what's the business driver for why we're investing this huge amount of money and frankly putting this person at risk? And if that's not clear, then don't send the person, because you will lose them in that process. So
if you're a middle manager, please be a champion or get more important so you can be a more effective champion. Yeah. So at that note, a successful panel is something where everybody learns something, even the panelists, from each other. I hope that we've accomplished that, and please join us in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Thank you for attending. This place will be open for a little bit out in the hallway, so you can aggressively network. And see you next time.